I raised him alone. Every night shift, every scraped knee, every science project, it was me. And on the biggest day of his life, I sat there like I was invisible. No speech, no mention, no seat at the head table. His new in-laws smiled politely, like I was the help. His bride called me Linda, not Mom. And when I cleared my throat during the rehearsal dinner to say a few words, someone gently touched my elbow and said, "Let's keep it brief. It's not really your place." So I didn't say a word, not when the music played, not when the cake was cut, not even when I was asked to move so the photographer could get a better family shot. But what they didn't know was that the DJ had a USB, and on it, a file, labeled, "For my son on his wedding day," and when it played, they couldn't unhear what I had to say. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Linda Lane. I was 68 years old when the wedding invitation finally arrived. It came on a Thursday afternoon tucked between a grocery store flyer and a bank statement, as if it were just another piece of mail, not the kind of envelope a mother waits her whole life to receive. There was no handwritten note, no personal message, just my name printed in block letters on a cream-colored card and an RSVP link at the bottom. I held it in my hands longer than necessary, staring at the elegant cursive font announcing my son's marriage to the woman he had known for less than 2 years. I lived alone in a small town outside of Madison, Wisconsin. After my retirement from nursing, I filled my days with quiet routines, morning walks, tending the herb garden in the backyard, reading the same novels over and over. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was calm, steady. And even though Thomas had moved out long ago, even though our phone calls had become less frequent and more formal, I had still imagined something different. I had imagined being involved. I had imagined being wanted. There was no mention of a rehearsal dinner, no inquiry about dietary restrictions, no suggestion of any role for me in the ceremony, just the date, time, venue, and instructions to arrive promptly. I told myself it was the modern way, that kids today did things differently, that maybe she had taken over the planning and he had just gone along with it. Still, I felt the cold edge of something unspoken pressed into the folds of that card. Not hatred, not even anger, just distance. I set the invitation on the kitchen table, next to a small vase of wilted tulips. They were the last blooms from the early spring. I hadn't replaced them. I watched the way their petals drooped and curled inward, as if drawing back from the world. Something about that mirrored how I felt. It had been years since I'd been invited anywhere that mattered, since anyone had asked me to dress up, since anyone had saved me a seat. I went upstairs to the bedroom, opened the closet, and ran my fingers across a line of dresses I hadn't worn in a decade. Some were from church gatherings, others from retirement parties, a few from birthdays that came and went with little fanfare. I stopped at a pale blue dress with lace sleeves, something soft and quiet, like the version of me that still believed in being included. I tried it on. It still fit, loosely now, which somehow felt both comforting and sad. The week before the wedding, I made a hair appointment, something I hadn't done in months. The stylist was a young girl who asked me if I had plans for the weekend. I told her my son was getting married. She smiled and asked if I was excited. I lied and said yes. The truth was harder to explain, that I was anxious and unsure and already feeling like a guest at someone else's life. I bought a new pair of shoes, low-heeled and simple, in case I'd be on my feet for hours. I picked out a gift from their registry, even though most of the good items were already gone. I settled on a set of kitchen knives, practical and sharp, wrapped them in silver paper, and tucked a handwritten note inside the box. I wrote things I didn't say aloud about how proud I was, how I remembered his first steps, his scraped knees, the way he used to whisper, "Love you, Mama," before bed. The morning of the wedding, I packed the gift carefully into the back seat of my car and set out early. The venue was in a converted barn just outside of Milwaukee, all rustic beams and wildflower arrangements. When I pulled into the parking lot, the attendants barely looked at me. No one greeted me. No one pointed me in the right direction. I followed the crowd, clutching my handbag and wondering where I was supposed to stand, where I belonged. Inside, everything smelled of fresh wood and rose petals. Strings of lights hung from the ceiling like stars, and soft music floated through the air. I spotted Thomas across the room in a fitted suit, laughing with a group of people I didn't know. His back was to me. He hadn't seen me yet. I thought about waving, but my hand stayed still. I felt out of place in a room filled with energy and youth, surrounded by faces I hadn't met, names I hadn't been told. Eventually, a young woman with a headset approached me and asked for my name. I told her. She looked at a tablet, then handed me a plain white place card with the number 19, written in small script. No title, no designation, just a number. I nodded and thanked her. She had already turned away. I looked around at the tables, each one closer to the front than the last. Parents of the bride, family of the groom, best friends, bridal party. All with signs, rolls, acknowledgments. Table 19 was near the back, close to the restrooms, far from the stage. I made my way there, heels quiet against the polished floor. The chair covers were white, the tablecloth a blush pink. My place was between an elderly couple who seemed to be friends of the groom's father and a young woman who spent the next 30 minutes scrolling on her phone. No one asked who I was. No one introduced themselves. No one noticed when I took a deep breath and folded my hands in my lap. I sat there, staring at the champagne flute in front of me, wondering if it would have made a difference had I not come at all. Wondering if I would have been missed, wondering if my son had forgotten how much I gave to get him here, to this moment in this suit, in this barn strung with lights. The room filled with noise and laughter, cameras flashed, music swelled. I sat at table 19, the mother of the groom, with nothing to do and nowhere to be. I arrived early, hoping to catch a glimpse of him before the ceremony began. I wasn't expecting a private conversation or a warm embrace. I knew better than to dream in vivid colors anymore, but I thought maybe I'd at least be acknowledged. A nod, a glance, a moment that said, "I see you." Instead, I stood near the entrance as guests trickled in, one after another, in pairs and groups, all beautifully dressed, all seemingly knowing exactly where to go and who to talk to. They smiled and laughed and hugged one another like a cast of a show I was never invited to audition for. No one looked at me. No one asked if I needed help. I stood there for several minutes, adjusting the small clutch in my hands, my fingers smoothing the edge of my dress again and again. Eventually, I took my seat at the table assigned to me. It was near the back, close to a set of double doors that led to a hallway where the staff came and went with trays of appetizers. The chairs were neatly aligned, the table elegantly set. But it was clear that this wasn't where the family sat. It was the overflow zone, the part of the room they hoped wouldn't appear in photographs. I tried not to read into it, but every detail screamed at me that I didn't belong. As the ceremony began, the music swelled and everyone stood. I craned my neck to see between the tall guests in front of me, catching only glimpses of white lace and flower petals as the bride walked down the aisle. I saw the back of my son's head, still and poised, as he waited at the altar. He didn't turn. He didn't look back. I whispered his name under my breath, not expecting him to hear me, but simply needing to say it. After the vows, after the kiss, after the applause and the recessional, guests began mingling again. Champagne flutes appeared in hands. Hors d'oeuvres were passed around on silver trays. I smiled at a few familiar faces, people I hadn't seen in years. They nodded politely, said something vague about how beautiful everything was, and then turned away to join louder, more animated conversations. I wandered over to the seating chart displayed on a large wooden board near the bar. Names were handwritten in swirling cursive, sorted by table. I looked for mine. There it was. Linda Lane, table 19. Just below a long list of names I didn't recognize. I scanned the upper numbers. Closer to the front, the head table, the wedding party, there were parents listed, friends, cousins. No mention of me beyond that distant placement. I felt like a placeholder, like someone they had to invite but hoped would quietly fade into the background. Dinner was announced and we moved to our seats. I listened as one by one people were called up to give speeches. The bride's father stood first, clearing his throat, his voice trembling with pride. He spoke of tradition, of his daughter's childhood, of how thrilled he was to welcome Thomas into their family. The guests applauded warmly. Then the maid of honor stood and told stories that made the room laugh. Then the best man, who made a few jokes and raised his glass. Everyone was engaged, smiling, nodding, basking in the glow of celebration. I waited. I kept waiting, thinking maybe there had been some mistake. Maybe someone would motion to me. Maybe they had saved me for last. Mothers often spoke near the end, offering heartfelt blessings or tender recollections. I had rehearsed a few words in my mind. Nothing dramatic, just a few lines about how proud I was, how much he meant to me, how I wished them both a life of kindness and patience. But no one called my name. No one handed me a microphone. No one turned toward my table. I watched as the DJ adjusted his controls, as waiters refilled glasses, as the evening moved forward without even the faintest pause in my direction. The moment I thought might come never did. It passed by without ceremony, without question, as if I didn't exist. After the speeches, the slideshow began. Childhood photos of the bride, her graduation day, summer trips, then photos of her and Thomas, picnics, vacations, holidays. They danced in fields, posed in front of murals, kissed beneath twinkling lights. The images flicked by one after another, curated carefully, a timeline that erased everything that came before her. I kept waiting for one photo of me and Thomas. One photo from his childhood, one moment that acknowledged our history. There was nothing. Not a single image of the years I carried him on my back when his legs were too tired to walk. Not a single frame of his 10th birthday party that I planned alone, or the night he won the spelling bee and ran into my arms. It was as if I had been written out of the script entirely. Like the story of his life had started the day he met her. As the first dance began, I stayed seated. Couples gathered around, clapping, cheering. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my shoulders stiff. I watched them sway, center stage, spotlights on their faces. He looked happy. He looked proud. And I, the woman who had raised him, who had taught him to tie his shoes, to drive a car, to face disappointment with grace, sat in the shadows, unnoticed. I looked around and realized that no one had spoken to me in over an hour. I had refilled my own water. I had cleared my plate when no server came by. I had smiled at passing guests who didn't smile back. It wasn't rudeness. It was indifference. They didn't know who I was, and worse, they didn't care. I began to understand then that I hadn't simply been overlooked. I had been intentionally omitted. There was no mistake. There was no forgotten note, no misplaced speech. I had been left out by design, and that hurt more than I ever imagined it could. I spent most of the reception pretending not to notice how invisible I had become. It wasn't an abrupt disappearance. It was slow, like fog rolling in, making everything around me dull and distant. People passed by me, reached across me, brushed my shoulder as if I were just a part of the furniture. I smiled when they did. It was automatic, a conditioned response from years of trying to be pleasant, to not take up space, to not demand more than what was offered. The dance floor filled quickly. The younger guests moved without hesitation, arms in the air, voices raised in laughter and song. The music pulsed through the floorboards beneath my feet, but I felt no urge to join. I had once been the woman who danced barefoot in the kitchen, who held her baby in her arms and twirled to the sound of the radio. I had once been light, but that part of me felt very far away now. I watched the dancers like someone watching a different life from the other side of glass. At some point, a server placed a small plate of cake in front of me. No words, just a quiet clink of china and silver. I thanked her, though she didn't hear me. I took a few bites, but the sweetness caught in my throat. I wasn't hungry. I had eaten enough disappointment for one day. From across the room, I noticed a photographer directing guests for a family portrait. I stood up, hopeful. Maybe now. Maybe this was the moment I would be pulled in, included, asked to stand beside my son like I mattered. I began to walk toward the group. I smoothed my dress and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. I approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt, not wanting to assume. But just as I got within a few feet, the photographer waved her hand toward me without turning her head. Not a gesture of welcome, a signal to move, to get out of the frame. I froze. For a moment I thought perhaps I had misunderstood, but then she tilted her camera and said something to the group that made them laugh. I saw Thomas nodding, arms around his bride and her family. I saw the way they fit together, seamless and proud, so I stepped back, quietly. I returned to my seat without drawing attention, my footsteps light on the hardwood floor. I sat down and stared at the remains of my cake. The icing now melted and smeared. The music changed again, a new beat rising, and the party resumed, but I didn't hear it. I heard only the hum of absence, the white noise of being unnecessary. Later, I walked toward the restroom, partly because I needed to, partly because I needed a moment to breathe. In the hallway, I passed a group of young women in satin gowns, bridesmaids. They barely glanced at me. One of them looked me over and handed me her clutch without a word, mistaking me for an attendant. I took it. I held it for a moment as she adjusted her makeup, then gave it back. She said nothing. She didn't thank me. She didn't ask my name. I stood in front of the mirror, washed my hands slowly, and stared at my own reflection. My face looked older in that bathroom light, not tired, just worn, as if time had settled itself permanently into every line. I didn't look like the person they remembered. Maybe I didn't look like his mother anymore. Maybe I had stopped being her in their eyes the moment he slipped a ring on someone else's finger. When I returned to the main room, the DJ was taking requests. A group of guests crowded around him, laughing, offering tips, making dedications. I waited until the cluster cleared, then approached. I asked if there might be a chance to say a few words, something short, just for the groom. The DJ glanced at the schedule and shook his head, flipping through his playlist. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't offer sympathy. But he did mention he could play a track if I had one. That was the rule, he said. No live interruptions, but pre-recorded audio was allowed. That moment sat with me. I thought about the USB I had tucked into my purse. I had recorded something weeks ago, not out of certainty, but out of instinct. I hadn't known why at the time. Just a quiet voice inside me that said, "Prepare." I didn't expect to need it, but standing there, beside a DJ who didn't know my name, in a room full of people who didn't care if I was even present, I realized I did. I handed him the USB without a word. He took it and placed it with the others, asking for the title of the file. I told him. He nodded, wrote it down on a Post-it, and returned to his equipment. I walked away. I didn't feel triumph or bitterness or revenge. I felt numb, like a woman walking through snow without gloves, the cold not hurting anymore because her skin had stopped responding. I returned to table 19, sat down again, and tried to collect myself. Around me, the party continued. Toasts were made, glasses were raised. People took selfies and clinked their forks against glasses to make the newlyweds kiss. I clapped politely when others did. I smiled when someone glanced my way. I performed motherhood like a silent role in a play that had rewritten its script. No one asked why I was quiet. No one noticed the shift in me, the way I had stopped waiting. I looked across the table at a melting candle and thought of all the times I had held a light for someone else, only to find myself sitting in the dark. I was still there. I had come. I had watched. I had remained. But in every way that mattered, I had already been erased. It started as a whisper in the back of my mind, a flicker of intuition, a quiet suggestion that came to me in the middle of a sleepless night. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow circles above me when the thought arrived. What if no one asks you to speak? What if you sit there all dressed up and no one offers you the floor? I tried to dismiss it. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was being dramatic, that of course there would be a place for me, but the thought didn't leave. It came back the next night, and the one after that, until I finally listened. I had never recorded anything like that before. I wasn't tech-savvy, and I didn't like hearing the sound of my own voice. But something told me I needed to do it. I borrowed a small voice recorder from the library, the kind students use for lectures, and I waited until the house was completely still. Then I sat at the kitchen table, just me and the machine, and I pressed record. At first, I didn't know what to say. I fumbled. I paused. I started over, but eventually the words began to flow, not as a speech, not as a performance, but as a letter, a voice carved in time, preserved in case I never got the chance to use it. I didn't write anything down. I didn't read from a page. I spoke from memory, from emotion, from years of being a mother who gave everything and asked for almost nothing. I talked about the night he was born, how the nurses placed him in my arms, and I whispered promises to him that I kept for decades. I told him about the nights I worked double shifts and came home to help him with math homework. I barely understood myself. I spoke about the time he caught the flu, and I stayed awake for 3 nights straight, checking his temperature every hour, waiting for the fever to break. I told him that love is not always loud or glamorous or visible, that sometimes love is packing school lunches at 4 in the morning, or sitting through school recitals in plastic chairs with a backache, or clapping the loudest even when your child forgets his lines. I reminded him of how I stood on freezing sidelines during his soccer games, how I clapped even when he lost, how I drove him to practice every day after my shifts at the hospital without ever once letting him see how tired I was. And then my voice softened. I spoke to his bride. I told her that I hoped she would build something real with him, something rooted in patience and grace. That a marriage isn't made from Instagram posts or flower arrangements, but from the 1,000 small choices you make to show up, even when it's hard, even when you don't feel like it, even when no one sees you do it. I said I hoped she would be the kind of woman who let love age honestly, not a woman who erased the people who came before her. I didn't cry during the recording. My voice trembled in places, but I stayed composed. I spoke slowly, clearly, like I wanted each word to land and linger. Near the end, I paused. I sat in silence for a moment, hearing nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator behind me. And then I said what I hadn't planned to say. I said, "If you don't see me at the front table, if you don't hear my name called, if no one tells you that I mattered, let this be the proof that I was here, that I loved, that I gave, that I held my place quietly but fiercely." I said that sometimes the people who are left out have the deepest roots, that sometimes the ones who are forgotten are the ones who held everything together. And then I ended with one simple line: "No matter what, you were always my boy. And even if you forget me, I will always remember you." I listened to the recording once after I finished it. I sat at the same table, the lights dimmed, and I let the sound of my own voice wash over me. It didn't sound like the woman I saw in the mirror. It sounded stronger, clearer, like someone who had finally decided she didn't need permission to speak. I copied the file to a USB drive and labeled it, "For my son, on his wedding day." I didn't know if I would ever need it. I hoped I wouldn't. I hoped I'd stand at a podium with a glass in my hand and a microphone, and I'd read a different version out loud to a room that smiled back at me. But in the quiet part of me, the part that knew what distance looked like, what silence felt like, I prepared anyway. I tucked the USB into my purse the morning of the wedding. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't plan how or when it would be used. I simply carried it with me like a talisman, like a safety net for my voice, in case no one offered me the chance to use it. And when the time came, when I stood by the DJ booth, when I realized no one had saved me a place in the story unfolding around me, I reached into my purse, pulled it out, and handed it over. He asked me the name of the file. I told him. He scribbled it down and moved on, never asking who I was, but it didn't matter, because when the moment came, my voice would rise. Not in protest, not in anger, in memory, in love, in truth. The lights dimmed just after dessert was served. I had been sitting still for so long my knees ached, but I didn't shift in my chair. I watched the staff begin to roll a projector screen down from the rafters, and a hush fell across the reception hall. The clinking of forks against plates stopped. The hum of conversation faded. Glasses were lifted one last time, and then hands were folded or clasped or dropped into laps as all eyes turned toward the glowing white sheet now stretched across the far wall. The slideshow began with soft music and a fade-in of childhood photos. It was the bride, of course, her in pigtails, her on a tricycle, her in a ballet costume, smiling awkwardly into the camera. Guests sighed with fondness, some chuckled, others whispered to their table mates about how cute she had been. I didn't recognize any of the faces, but I watched anyway, politely, patiently. Then came pictures of her and Thomas together. Vacations, parties, holidays, filtered photographs full of staged joy and matching outfits. The room filled with a warm nostalgia for a life I had never been invited to see. I waited for my moment. Not in the slideshow, I already knew there would be nothing of me there, but for something else. I didn't know exactly when it would come. I only knew that it would. The music shifted once more, slowing into a more intimate melody. The screen flickered black. At first, the room remained quiet, expecting a pause before the next image, but instead of a picture, they heard my voice. The sound was soft at first, calm, clear. It played over the speakers gently as if someone were reading a letter aloud in the corner of a quiet room. I sat very still at my table, hands folded in my lap, heart beating so loudly I was sure the woman beside me could hear it. People turned in their seats, looking around, trying to locate the speaker. Some looked confused, others curious. A few looked irritated, as though something had gone off script. But no one moved. No one interrupted. My voice filled the space. It wasn't an angry voice. There was no bitterness in it, only steady truth. I spoke of love, of sacrifice, of motherhood. I spoke of late nights and first steps, of scraped knees and whispered prayers in hospital parking lots. I spoke of standing on the sidelines, of watching from the background, of being proud even when I was exhausted. My voice didn't crack. I had practiced this moment in my mind without realizing it for years. I knew how to speak when it mattered. I heard someone gasp when I mentioned holding Thomas the night he ran a fever so high I nearly called an ambulance. Another voice muttered something, maybe a question, maybe a protest. But no one spoke over the recording. It moved too fast for them to catch it, yet slow enough to pierce. I didn't look at Thomas. I couldn't. I didn't know what face he wore in that moment, whether it was shame or confusion or something else entirely. I only knew he was hearing me, truly hearing me for the first time in a very long while. When I addressed his bride, there was a shift in the air. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't scolding. I spoke gently with the measured clarity of a woman who had waited a long time to say a few very important things. I wished her well. I asked her to take care of him, to remember what came before her. I asked her not to erase the woman who had raised him, not to treat a mother like an old chapter in a book they were trying to forget. I didn't tell them I was hurt. I let the silence between my sentences do that. I didn't accuse anyone. I let the facts speak louder than blame. I let the weight of absence, my absence, settle into their laps like a slow realization that perhaps they had missed something irreplaceable. And then, near the end, came the line I remembered most. It was one I hadn't rehearsed. It had come to me only in the moment I first recorded it, but it rang louder in that room than anything else I had said. If you don't see me at your table, it's not because I didn't want to be there. It's because you didn't leave me a chair. The room was completely silent. No claps, no whispers, no movement, just stillness. A kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. I could feel the eyes on me now. They knew whose voice it was. They didn't need confirmation. The audio ended quietly. No dramatic fade out, just the natural end of a sentence, and then nothing but the low hum of the sound system, reverting to standby. The light stayed dim for a moment longer, like the room itself needed a second to adjust. Then the projector screen rolled back into the ceiling. No one said anything right away. The music didn't resume. The DJ didn't try to fill the silence with applause or a joke. People sat still in their chairs, napkins clenched, eyes lowered. I watched the way they avoided each other's glances, how some reached for their drinks or straightened the cutlery in front of them just to have something to do. I didn't stand up. I didn't wave or smile or look for approval. I stayed in my seat, quiet and composed, the same way I had been all evening. But now? The room was different. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer mistaken for staff or ignored at my table. They had heard me. They had seen me, even if only for 5 minutes. And maybe that was all I had ever needed, Not a spotlight, not a standing ovation, just to be acknowledged, just to have a moment that belonged to me. The room didn't return to normal right away. It couldn't. My voice still lingered in the air, as if it had settled into the corners of the ceiling, into the folds of the linen napkins, and the flickering flames of the votive candles. The silence that followed the recording had weight. It pressed down on every table, filled every empty space between the plates and glasses. People shifted in their seats, but no one seemed quite ready to move. It was as if the entire reception had been knocked slightly off balance, and no one knew which direction to lean in to catch themselves. The music didn't start again for several minutes. I think even the DJ hesitated, unsure of what kind of song could possibly follow what had just played. I watched him from a distance as he looked around, shuffled his list, then finally pressed a button that sent a soft instrumental tune through the speakers. Something safe, something neutral. But the guests didn't rise from their seats right away. Their conversations resumed only in cautious whispers, like children afraid to speak too loudly after witnessing something sacred. I sat still, keeping my gaze steady on the centerpiece in front of me. It was a tall glass vase filled with hydrangeas, tinted blush and ivory. I counted the petals as if they could anchor me in the moment. I didn't want to look around the room yet. I wasn't ready to see the eyes that had watched me all night without seeing me at all. Now they had heard me, and that changed things. I felt it in the way their glances occasionally brushed past me, quickly, uncertainly, as if looking for the right expression to wear and not finding it. One woman from a nearby table leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her hand. The other nodded, her brow furrowed. A few rows up, a man in a gray suit rubbed his jaw and kept his eyes low, his dessert untouched. At another table, a bridesmaid reached for her glass with trembling fingers. She wasn't smiling anymore. I wasn't naive enough to believe that my voice alone had changed their hearts, but I knew it had interrupted the fantasy, the neatness, the performance, the idea that everything was picture perfect and tightly controlled. My words had disturbed that surface, cracked it just enough for reality to seep in, and now they didn't know what to do with the discomfort. Across the room, the bride sat frozen. Her smile had vanished, her hands were still pressed flat against the tablecloth, and her eyes flickered between the faces of her parents and the empty space beside her, the seat where Thomas had been. He was gone. I spotted him near the entrance to the patio, standing alone, his back turned to the room. He had one hand on the door frame, as if he were bracing himself against something invisible. I watched him quietly. He hadn't looked at me yet, not once since the recording had played, but he hadn't left. That meant something. A server passed by with a tray of wine, and I gently shook my head. I didn't want anything to drink. I didn't want anything at all. I just wanted to sit inside the stillness for a while longer. I wanted to memorize how it felt to finally be heard. A woman I didn't know walked past me and placed her hand briefly on my shoulder. She didn't speak. She didn't stop. Just a light touch, and then she continued on. It wasn't pity. It wasn't shame. It was acknowledgement. And that was enough. Another guest, older, perhaps a friend of the groom's father, met my eyes from across the room and gave a slow nod. I returned it, a subtle exchange between two people who understood that words weren't always necessary, that sometimes presence was its own kind of speech. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed in tone. They weren't dismissive. They weren't cruel. They were cautious. Almost reverent, like people trying to piece together a story they hadn't realized was being told all along. I could feel the way they tiptoed around the truth, afraid to admit that they had missed something, afraid to realize that their silence had made them complicit. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel vindicated. If anything, I felt a quiet ache. Not for myself, but for everything they had never known about me. The parts of my life that had happened while they looked the other way. The sacrifices, the loneliness, the unspoken pride I had carried for years without asking anyone to notice. I had never asked for a spotlight, only a seat, only a voice, only a moment. And now that moment had passed, leaving its echo behind in soft, careful whispers that spread across the room like ripples in water after a stone has been dropped. The music swelled slightly. A few couples stood and began to dance again, but the energy was different now. Softer, quieter, more human. The celebration had been tempered by reality, and though no one said it aloud, I could feel it in the way people moved. Less performance, more presence. I sat back in my chair, allowing myself to exhale fully for the first time that evening. My hands relaxed in my lap. My shoulders lowered, my chest softened. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding anything back. He found me when most of the guests had already begun to drift toward the exits. The music had lowered to a hum, reduced to background noise no one really heard anymore. The waitstaff moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this 100 times before. Collecting empty glasses, straightening linens, sweeping away confetti that had settled on the floor like forgotten snow. Conversations had turned hushed and fragmented. Laughter had thinned out. The electricity of celebration had given way to something more subdued, more tentative, a party winding down, a night already giving itself over to memory. I remained at my table, unwilling to leave just yet, though I had no real reason to stay. I wasn't waiting for closure. I wasn't expecting apologies. I just didn't want to move. The thought of standing, of walking back through that room, of gathering my coat from the rack and stepping alone into the night air, it all felt heavier than I expected. So I stayed. One hand resting lightly on the tablecloth, my purse still at my feet, my chair turned slightly away from the center of the room, angled toward a window where the reflection of the dance floor shimmered dimly against the glass. That's when I saw him. Thomas stood a few feet away, no longer part of any group, no longer framed by the backdrop of guests and noise. He wasn't with his new wife. He wasn't laughing or posing for pictures or fielding congratulations. He was just there, still in his suit, the boutonniere at his lapel slightly askew, one hand hanging at his side while the other gripped something in his pocket. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I simply met his eyes. He approached slowly, his steps hesitant, not because he was unsure of where to go, but because he was unsure of what to say. That much was written all over his face. And when he finally reached my table, he didn't speak. Not right away. He stood there, silent, the air around him thick with everything unspoken. I waited. Not out of pride or defiance, but because I knew he needed the silence more than I did. The silence was his to break, not mine. Then gently he pulled something from the inside pocket of his jacket and extended it toward me. A folded piece of paper. I recognized it before my fingers even touched it. It was the speech I had written weeks ago, the one I had planned to read. The one I had rehearsed aloud in my kitchen in the early hours of the morning. I had tucked it into the card that accompanied the gift, unsure if anyone would ever read it, but somehow it had found its way back to me. I took the paper without opening it. I didn't need to see the words. I knew them by heart. He stood there for another moment, then sat beside me, not close, but not distant either. A quiet, uncertain truce existed between us now. The kind that didn't ask for answers, only presence. We didn't face each other. We didn't reach for hands or lean in. We simply sat, side by side, two people stitched together by a long, complicated thread that neither of us quite knew how to untangle. The noises of the reception grew fainter around us. Chairs scraped against the floor as people began to gather their things. Someone laughed near the entrance, a final echo of joy before it disappeared into the parking lot. I could hear the soft flutter of discarded napkins as they were folded and cleared. The night was ending. He breathed deeply once, not quite a sigh, but something close. I looked straight ahead, out the window, where the sky had turned the color of bruised lavender, that in-between hue that lives just before full darkness. It was beautiful in a quiet, fading way, fleeting, honest. I didn't know what he was thinking. I didn't know if he was sorry or confused or simply overwhelmed, and I didn't ask. There are some things that don't need to be articulated to be understood. Some things that live between the lines, in the glances and gestures and long silences shared between people who once meant everything to each other. After a while, I stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just calmly. I reached down and picked up my purse, feeling the gentle weight of it swing against my arm. Then I placed the folded paper, my speech, into his hand and closed his fingers around it. He didn't resist. He didn't let go either. We stood there for a few seconds longer, and then I turned and began to walk away. I didn't look back, not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to. There was nothing behind me that required a second glance. The night had given me what I hadn't even known I needed. Not justice, not revenge, not even vindication. Just a moment where my voice had existed in the air, untouchable and undeniable. A moment where the people who had overlooked me were forced to listen. A moment where the child I had raised had to confront the reality of who I still was. I walked past the last of the guests, past the table of wedding favors no one had bothered to claim, past the flickering candles that had begun to sputter out. I stepped out into the night and let the door close behind me. The air was cool, the sky wide and indifferent, and I breathed. I drove home in silence. No radio, no GPS voice, just the rhythm of the tires against the highway and the faint hum of the world outside the windows. The night passed slowly around me, the sky deepening into ink as I followed the familiar roads back to the quiet corners of my life. Streetlights flickered by like distant memories, some dim, some too bright, all too brief. I didn't think much as I drove. My mind wasn't empty, but it wasn't racing either. I was settling, like dust after a storm. The streets of my neighborhood were mostly dark when I turned in. Porch lights here and there, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, the comforting stillness of small-town nights. I parked in my usual spot, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. My front porch light was still on, glowing faintly, casting a soft yellow arc across the walkway. It was a light I'd left on for years, for my son when he was late, for guests who rarely came, for myself on nights like this. I walked slowly up the path, key in hand, heels pressing into the same cracks in the pavement I'd stepped over 1,000 times. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Everything was just as I had left it. The quilt folded on the arm of the couch, the half-full glass of water on the kitchen counter, the lamp still glowing in the corner of the living room like a guardian watching the space in my absence. I slipped off my shoes by the door, padded into the kitchen, and turned on the kettle. The familiarity of the motions grounded me, Fill, click, wait, the soft sounds of home. I reached for my favorite mug, chipped slightly at the rim, the one with the faded print of a daisy, and pulled the tea tin from the shelf. I didn't rush. There was no need to. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't rushing to please anyone, to finish something before being asked for more. The water boiled. I poured. I waited. In the living room, I sat down by the window and pulled the blanket over my lap. The tea steamed gently between my palms. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and the moon had risen higher now, quiet and distant like a secret. The silence wasn't lonely. It was full, whole, alive with the quiet pulse of presence. I thought about the wedding, about the faces, the voices, the way the air had shifted when my recording played. I thought about the look in his eyes when he stood beside me. I didn't replay the night to find validation. I wasn't trying to relive it. I simply let the memory settle, like a stone sinking to the bottom of a still lake. I had spoken. That was all. Not shouted, not demanded, not fought, just spoken. And I had been heard. I wasn't sure what would come next. I didn't know if he would call or if she would write or if anything in their new life would carry the echo of what I said, but I knew it didn't matter. Not anymore. I had spent too many years measuring my worth by what I was to others. Mother, helper, afterthought. I had folded myself into the background, dimmed my light so others could shine. I had let birthdays pass without celebration, let insults slide in the name of peace, stayed quiet so others could be comfortable. But that night had changed something, not just in the room, in me. I looked around my home, not large, not grand, but mine. Every photograph on the wall had been hung by my hands. Every book on the shelf touched by my fingers. Every cup, every chair, every wrinkle in the rug, every scratch on the hardwood was a part of my story, my place. Not a seat I was given, not a role I was assigned, but a space I had built with every quiet, unnoticed act of love. I took a sip of tea. It was still too hot. I let it burn a little on my tongue. It reminded me I was still here, still feeling, still alive. At some point, I stood and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. I changed into my nightgown, washed my face, brushed my hair, each action slow, deliberate, cleansing. I turned down the covers, slid into bed, and lay back against the pillows. The room was dark but not cold. The quiet wasn't heavy. It was peace. I closed my eyes and let the weight of the day lift from my body, not all at once, not like a sudden relief, but gradually, like dusk yielding to night, like grief giving way to grace. I didn't know what they would remember from the wedding. I didn't know what others would say about me when they returned to their homes, their routines, their filtered photographs of a perfect evening. But I knew what I would carry. I carried the sound of my own voice. I carried the truth I had spoken. I carried myself whole and finally seen.